Welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activist. Learn languages, make a difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Zebra Lopez, and today we have a very special article we're going to discuss, written by Alberto Bruzo just last year, and entitled, Can Language Be Commodified? Toward a Marxist Theory of Language Commodification. Now, first things first. The author asks, is language commodification possible? Does this collocation, language and commodification together, even make sense, right? And there are some authors that answer this question in the positive, particularly scholars from the fields of linguistic anthropology and critical discourse analysis, or CDA for short. However, the very idea of language commodification has also been challenged from language minority theorists, language economics, and Marxist approaches to language and commodification. And it is precisely on these Marxist approaches to language and commodification and their critique of the notion of language commodification that this article focuses. Now, for those who endorse the idea of language commodification, this collocation began to be popular in the late 80s and early 90s, motivated by the shifting economical and political landscape. So it's a key aspect of globalization and neoliberal policies and ideologies, this idea of language commodification. And as such, it needs to be understood from a context where capitalist rationality seems to be subsuming everything else, including language, right? And so, as we said, there are two main scholarly fields where this idea of language commodification has gained currency, i.e. language anthropology on the one hand, mostly influenced by Bourdieu, and with the idea that language practices are symbolic resources that can be exchanged for material good, or more broadly for social power and advantages in general. And then there's the other field that has grappled with this notion, which is CDA, and mostly influenced by the ideas of Fairclough. These authors are concerned with the ways in which changes in discourse are influenced by the hegemonic rationality of capitalism. One of the most important publications in the 21st century in this regard comes from Heller and Duchesne, and both authors converge in the diagnosis that there seems to be a shift from understanding languages as markers of ethno-national identity, which is a discourse of pride, to understanding languages as marketable commodities and technical skills, which is a discourse of profit, right? Again, this idea that language is more and more subsumed under the neoliberal rationality. I think a brilliant summary of what language commodification is all about is offered by Bruzos on page 3 of this article, where he claims that language can be commodified as a technical skill, manageable through techniques and technologies to standardize and control communication, and as a source of symbolic added value, when language is used emblematically to authenticate ethnic products and niche tourism markets. So these are the two main ways in which language can be commodified, right? Either understood as a technical skill or post-vernacularly as a source of symbolic value. Now, as we said before, this idea of language commodification has been challenged, amongst others, from a Marxist perspective. And those approaches are the ones with which Bruzos is concerned in the article. So there is a rather long section about the conceptualization of language from a Marxist perspective, which is very informative. I suggest that you read it, but it's perhaps not what the focus of the article should be, or what the most interesting, insightful part of this article is about. And at any rate, what Marxist approaches to language commodification have in common is that for these authors, language is an important element of political economy. They're not denying that language is a key aspect of political economy. What they're taking issue with are the following four aspects. First, if we understand language as a commodity, this reproduces neoliberal conceptualizations of language as human capital, so that the critique that you want to carry out ends up reproducing the very aspects that you found problematic. This is fair criticism, in my opinion. In addition to this, Marxist approaches to language commodification contend that language commodification, this idea, this collocation of language and commodification together to create a new concept, is not really present in Marx's work. It does not directly engage it either. Rather, it's based on using the term commodity loosely and or as a metaphor. For instance, some authors draw upon Polanyi to say that language is not so much a commodity as it is a fictitious commodity, because it's not produced for exchange and consumption. Therefore, you cannot actually say, strictly speaking, that language is a commodity per se. It is, if anything, a fictitious commodity. Third aspect, different concepts should be used as alternatives for the term commodification. So rather than talking about language commodification, we should talk about language alienation, language reification, language fetishism perhaps, language resource and instrument, but not strictly speaking about language commodification. So as I said, from here, the author Bruzos goes on to carry an ample literature review about what Marxist authors have historically thought about language. I think that that review is perhaps too extensive, as I said, and is best summarized at any rate in these two paragraphs that I just wrote there on the right bottom corner. A Marxist theory of language, regardless of who articulates it, is typically premised on the understanding that language has three characteristics. Language is a social practice as opposed to an individual practice. It's a historical entity rather than operating in an atemporal vacuum, and it's ideological rather than neutral or post-ideological. And the main authors are three, I would say: Voloshinov, Bakhtin, and Gramsci. If one wants to understand the Marxist conceptualization of language throughout history, one cannot circumvent the reading of these three authors. Sure, there are many others like Leclerc, etc., but these three, I think, are the most relevant ones. Now, this understanding of language as, again, social practice, historical and ideological entity, is in contrast with traditional, structural, and generative linguistic approaches, which tend to see languages as already predetermined, finite objects whose main characteristics are removed from the socio-historical context, which includes ideological considerations. Now, Bruzos concludes from this that a Marxist approach to language commodification should include at least three elements. And I think that this is actually very, very interesting. First, it should include a political and historical contextualization. In the words of Bruzos, a historical perspective is needed to situate language commodification in the context of the development of capitalism and the institutions of liberal society: nation, state, institutions, markets, etc. This aspect is key. We need to understand language policies of standardization and commodification in a historical context. Now, Bruzos says that this tendency dates back to the second half of the 18th century. And then in the conclusion says that it can even be taken back to the 16th century. I would even be more radical and say that we can already find this narrow link between the nation the language, and a political entity that resembles a proto-state, at least, in 1492 in the Iberian Peninsula with the union of the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon to advance language standardization and homogenization. These could be considered proto-instances of the kind of rationality that underlies what some authors have now described as language commodification. So I think that we could go back to 1492, at least in the case of the Iberian Peninsula. But certainly, discourses of colonialism and the 18th century widespread formation of the nation state contribute decisively to these policies of language standardization that are at the root of subsequent language commodification beginning in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Bruzos also points out something very interesting. He says, other productive lines of dialogue could be with the literatures of racial linguistics and translanguaging, since these concepts rest as well on a historical perspective and a critique of power. And here I would like to add, obviously, glottal politics, right? Which is a school of thought that is very strong in New York City, for instance, and is at the intersection of glottal, language, and politics, right? So the critique of power is also central to glottal politics as an approach. So I would say, yeah, racial linguistics, translanguaging, and glottal politics. Those are all fields that intersect with a genuine Marxist critique of language. The second aspect that is important in Bruzos' conclusion, in my opinion, is the focus shift. He says that, and I quote, a systemic and critical perspective is needed to turn the focus from the effects of commodification on language to the effects on society and speakers. Again, this goes back to the idea that language is a social practice in the eyes of Marxist authors, which means that we should not be as concerned with languages understood in a structural sense, but rather with what the effects of that commodification that we are denouncing are on society and speakers, which are what languages are all about, ultimately. In addition to this, he notes that there are certain gaps in the literature on language commodification, paramount amongst which are the idea of social conflict, and more specifically, the notions of class and the critique of capitalism. I think that Bruzos is right on the money here. I think social conflict is under-theorized in Marxist critiques of language commodification. But in addition to that, I will also say that sometimes social conflict, the so-called agonistic perspective on language, is also overrepresented in certain Marxist approaches to language commodification. For instance, the school of thought that I just referred to, glottal politics, I think tends to assume that any kind of dynamic and interaction apropos language needs to be necessarily conflictual, which is to overstate the conflict part of social interaction in language. To be sure, conflict is an inherent part of social interaction, but it's not the only way in which that social interaction crystallizes. So yes, we need to pay attention to social conflict in language, but not all forms of social interaction concerning language can be reduced to conflict or should be reduced to conflict for that matter. And finally, and I think this is a key insight from Bruzos, I can only wish that he had perhaps developed that more fully, is the idea that we need to shift from theory to practice. He says, and this is key, the important question is not whether language can be considered a commodity, but whether without profound social changes, language can be conceived otherwise. To the extent to which that neoliberal rationality subsumes language nowadays, it is almost impossible to see how language could not be thought of as a commodity. Can we even imagine the conditions under which this could not be the case? Is Bruzos saying, which is very resembling of Slavoj Žižek's take that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism or what the post-capitalist society looks like. It's kind of the same idea here. And the last sentence of this article goes, just as caring for language is an issue of political and civic responsibility, the question of whether language can be decommodified takes us from theory to practice. It is not an abstract question, it is a question of the way in which language functions historically in our time, ideologically, and socially. So that's all from me. You have the full article linked in the description below. I hope you find it interesting. Let me know whether you agreed or disagree with my take on it. And if you have any new ideas, please share them as well. And as always, thanks for watching.